It was a bright and sunny afternoon at the local suburban park where families gathered for picnics. Children laughed on the playground, and the hum of casual conversations filled the air. On a shaded bench, a man named Gabe Carter sat quietly, enjoying the tranquility of the day. In his mid-40s, Gabe exuded a sense of calm as he read from a worn paperback book, seemingly oblivious to the stares his red Maga hat had attracted across the park. Catherine Simmons, a woman in her 30s, stood with her dog, her eyes narrowing at the sight of Gabe. She muttered to herself, her expression hardening at the sight of the political symbol. To Catherine, it was a provocation, something that had no place in her beloved community. Unable to contain her growing frustration, Catherine decided to take action. She approached Gabe, her voice filled with an accusatory edge, and demanded that he leave the park. When Gabe remained composed and unbothered by her outburst, Catherine's irritation only grew. Determined to escalate, she pulled out her phone, intent on calling the police. What happens next will leave you speechless. Before we dive deeper into this jaw-dropping story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have you ever witnessed a situation like this? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Catherine Simmons, or Karen as some onlookers would later call her, watched Gabe Carter from a distance, her irritation bubbling up with every passing second. She could feel her heart pound as she eyed the red Maga hat sitting proudly atop his head. To Catherine, it was more than just a piece of clothing. It was a symbol of everything she opposed. It represented a worldview she was vehemently against, one she believed had no place in this peaceful suburban park. The sight of families having picnics, children playing, and the general sense of community made her feel responsible for maintaining an inclusive environment. The hat, in her eyes, threatened that sense of safety. Gabe, sitting there reading his book, seemed oblivious to the effect his presence was having. She took it as a deliberate provocation, a challenge to people like her. Catherine had always believed in standing up for her values, and today she decided she would do just that. With her dog by her side, she strode over to where Gabe was sitting, her footsteps brisk and determined. She didn't bother to hide her displeasure as she approached, her gaze fixed on the hat. Gabe glanced up from his book, meeting her eyes briefly before returning his attention to the pages. His calm demeanor only served to fuel her irritation further. "Excuse me," Catherine snapped, her voice cutting through the ambient park noise. Gabe looked up again, this time with raised eyebrows, acknowledging her presence. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest, her stance rigid. "People like you are not welcome here," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. Gabe regarded her for a moment, then glanced around the park as if to make sure she was indeed talking to him. "I'm just sitting here reading my book," he said, his voice calm and steady, without a hint of aggression. But Catherine wasn't having it. The sight of that hat, coupled with Gabe's lack of reaction, made her feel ignored and disrespected. "That hat represents hate," she declared, her voice growing louder. Several heads turned in their direction, the peaceful atmosphere of the park beginning to shift. "You're making people uncomfortable, and I think it's time for you to leave." Gabe sighed, closing his book slowly, his eyes still fixed on Catherine. "Ma'am, I'm not here to bother anyone. I'm just enjoying the weather and reading," he said, keeping his tone even. "I'm not trying to start anything." The way Gabe spoke, so calm, so composed, seemed to mock Catherine. She felt a flush of frustration, a heat rising in her chest. She had expected him to be confrontational, to give her a reason to feel justified in her anger. Instead, he was polite, collected, and worst of all, unbothered by her demands. The onlookers who had stopped to watch seemed confused, some even annoyed by her escalating tone. She glanced around, noticing that people were starting to whisper amongst themselves. Some seemed to agree with her. She caught sight of a woman nodding in approval, but others rolled their eyes or turned away, clearly unwilling to get involved in the confrontation. A few younger people had even taken out their phones, recording the exchange. Catherine's sense of urgency intensified. She felt like she was losing control of the situation. "You think you can just come here and intimidate people with that hat?" Catherine continued, her voice rising. She pointed at the bright red cap. "You're deliberately trying to provoke everyone in this park." Gabe shook his head, his expression remaining neutral. "That's not my intention at all," he said. "I'm not here to cause trouble, ma'am. I think you're making this a bigger issue than it needs to be." His words only further infuriated her. Catherine felt like he was dismissing her concerns, brushing off her attempt to stand up for what she believed in. She could sense the eyes of the crowd on her, waiting to see what she would do next. Her face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. She refused to back down now, not when she felt she was fighting for something important. "Enough of this," she snapped, pulling out her phone with an exaggerated motion, making sure everyone could see what she was doing. She quickly dialed 911, her fingers trembling slightly, though whether from anger or nerves, she wasn't sure. She turned away from Gabe as the call connected, her voice switching to one of urgency. "Yes, hello, I'm at Greenfield Park, and there's a man here making everyone uncomfortable. He's wearing one of those hats, and he's being aggressive," Catherine said, her voice breathless as she glanced back at Gabe, who hadn't moved from his spot. Gabe simply watched her, a small sigh escaping his lips. He shook his head slightly, then leaned back against the bench, seemingly resigned to what was happening. The people around them began to grow more uneasy. Some backed away while others continued recording, clearly intrigued by the unfolding drama. Catherine ended the call, slipping her phone back into her pocket. She turned back to Gabe, her eyes filled with a mix of triumph and indignation. "The police are on their way," she said, her tone laced with satisfaction. "Maybe they'll get you to leave since you clearly won't listen to reason." Gabe didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, giving her a calm, almost tired smile. "I'll wait here then," he said. Catherine felt a surge of satisfaction. Finally, she thought, someone would deal with him properly. She stepped back, keeping her eyes on Gabe as if daring him to make a wrong move before the authorities arrived. The tension in the park was thick now, the air almost crackling with anticipation as they waited. The onlookers exchanged glances, some murmuring amongst themselves. The phones continued to record, capturing every detail of the confrontation. Little did Catherine know that her call to the police was about to lead to an outcome she never could have predicted. It didn't take long for the sound of distant sirens to fill the park, growing louder as they approached. The crowd's murmurs intensified, the anticipation almost palpable as people craned their necks to see what would happen next. Catherine stood with her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on Gabe, who remained seated, his expression calm as ever. She could feel the rush of satisfaction building within her, convinced that the officers would remove Gabe and restore what she perceived as order to the park. A police car pulled up near the entrance of the park, and two uniformed officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the area before quickly spotting the crowd that had gathered around Gabe and Catherine. They walked over with purpose, their presence immediately commanding attention. People moved aside, creating a clear path for the officers to approach the scene. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and the onlookers whispered to each other, speculating about what would happen next. Catherine's eyes lit up as the officers approached. She hurried toward them, her voice eager as she began recounting her version of events. "Officers, thank you for coming. That man over there," she pointed at Gabe, "he's making everyone here uncomfortable. He's wearing that hat, and he's been aggressive. I just want him to leave." Her voice wavered slightly as she spoke, but she held her ground, her determination to get rid of Gabe unwavering. The officers exchanged glances before one of them, a tall man with a stern expression, gestured for Catherine to take a step back. "Ma'am, we'll handle this," he said, his voice measured, giving nothing away. They turned their attention to Gabe, who was still sitting on the bench, his book resting on his lap, his face calm and composed, as if he had been expecting this all along. "Sir," the first officer said as they approached, "we received a call about a disturbance. Would you mind telling us what's going on here?" Gabe looked up at the officers, offering a polite nod. "Of course, officers," he said, his tone calm and respectful. "I've just been sitting here reading my book. This lady came over and started telling me I needed to leave because of my hat. I haven't done anything to provoke anyone." He gestured toward the book resting on his lap as if to emphasize his harmlessness. The second officer, a woman with a kind but professional demeanor, studied Gabe for a moment before glancing over at Catherine, who was standing a few feet away, her arms still crossed, her expression one of indignation. The officer then looked back at Gabe. "And you haven't been aggressive or made any threats?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly as she assessed his response. Gabe shook his head. "No, ma'am. I've just been sitting here minding my own business. I understand that the hat might bother some people, but I have no intention of causing trouble." His voice remained even, without a hint of defensiveness, as if he was simply stating a fact. The first officer looked around at the gathered crowd, many of whom were still recording. He could see the curious, expectant faces of onlookers, some nodding in agreement with Gabe's version of events, while others seemed unsure of what to think. He then turned back to Catherine. "Ma'am, can you tell us exactly what this man did that you found threatening?" he asked, his tone growing firmer. Catherine's face flushed, and she hesitated for a moment. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, and the pressure to justify her actions weighed heavily on her. "Well, it's the hat," she said, her voice faltering slightly. "It's a symbol of hate, and it makes people uncomfortable. He's trying to provoke us." Her gaze flicked nervously to the people watching, hoping for support, but she found only skeptical expressions. The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions neutral but clearly skeptical. The female officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, wearing a hat, even one that some might find controversial, is not a crime. Unless this man has threatened you or someone else here, he's not breaking any laws." Her voice was steady, leaving no room for argument. Catherine's eyes widened, her frustration evident. She could feel the control of the situation slipping away from her. "But he's trying to intimidate people," she insisted, her voice growing shrill. "That hat represents everything that's wrong with this country." Her words hung in the air, met with a few stifled laughs from the crowd. She could see the disapproving looks, the head shakes, and her confidence began to waver. The male officer raised a hand, his voice remaining calm. "Ma'am, we need specific examples of threatening behavior. Just wearing a hat doesn't qualify as a threat. We're here to ensure everyone's safety, and from what we've gathered, this gentleman hasn't done anything wrong." He spoke slowly, as if trying to make sure Catherine understood each word. Catherine opened her mouth to argue further, but the murmurs from the crowd were growing louder, and she could feel the tide turning against her. People were shaking their heads, some even chuckling at the absurdity of the situation. Her face flushed a deep shade of red, her confidence beginning to waver as the realization hit her that perhaps she had gone too far. The female officer stepped aside and spoke quietly into her radio, requesting more information on the individuals involved. As she waited for a response, she kept her eyes on Gabe, who remained calm and composed, his hands resting on his book, his expression giving nothing away. The male officer, meanwhile, continued to address Catherine, trying to de-escalate the situation and keep things from escalating further. After a few moments, the radio crackled to life, and the female officer listened carefully, her eyes widening slightly as she received the information. Her posture shifted subtly. She glanced over at her partner, then at Gabe, her expression shifting from neutrality to one of recognition. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. She leaned over to the male officer, whispering something in his ear. His eyebrows lifted in surprise, and he glanced at Gabe, who gave a small, knowing smile, but remained silent, his eyes meeting the officers with a look that spoke of understanding. The officers exchanged another look, clearly realizing that this situation was not at all what Catherine had made it out to be. The male officer straightened his gaze, shifting back to Catherine, who stood there with her arms crossed, still expecting them to take action against Gabe. The officer's skepticism was now evident as they looked between Catherine and Gabe, sensing that there was much more to this story than they had initially been led to believe. The crowd, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, began to murmur more loudly, and Catherine felt her resolve beginning to crumble under the weight of her own actions. The officers, now fully aware of who Gabe Carter was, took a moment to reassess the situation. The female officer kept her gaze on Gabe, her demeanor shifting from the typical firmness used during an intervention to something closer to respect. She gave Gabe a small nod, and he returned it, his lips curling slightly into a wry smile. But he remained silent, allowing the officers to handle the matter as they saw fit. There was a sense of control in his posture. He knew exactly how this was going to end, but he was willing to see it through patiently. Catherine stood with her arms crossed, her eyes darting between the officers and Gabe, still holding on to her conviction that the man before her was somehow in the wrong. She watched as the officers exchanged whispered words, her face contorting with confusion as she struggled to catch a hint of what they were discussing. Her confidence began to waver as she noticed the officers' increasingly skeptical glances. What could possibly be taking them so long? In her mind, it was a simple matter. A disruptive individual needed to be removed, and they should be escorting Gabe out by now. After a few minutes, the male officer turned back towards Catherine, his expression neutral, but his eyes betraying a hint of exasperation. "Ma'am," he began, "we've spoken to several witnesses here, and from what we can gather, there doesn't seem to be any credible threat. Mr. Carter hasn't broken any laws. He's not causing any disturbance that warrants police action." Catherine opened her mouth, ready to argue her point again, but the words faltered on her lips. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, and she could feel the weight of their eyes on her, a mix of judgment, disapproval, and curiosity. Her earlier smugness was rapidly eroding, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. The attention, once gratifying, now felt suffocating. It wasn't supposed to go this way. She had expected the officers to validate her concerns, to reinforce her sense of righteousness, but instead they seemed to be turning on her. "But he's wearing that hat," Catherine stammered, her eyes widening as she gestured toward Gabe. "He's trying to provoke us. I can't be the only one who feels this way." The male officer glanced at the hat, then at Catherine. His tone was measured as he responded, "Ma'am, as my partner mentioned, wearing a hat, even one that some may find offensive, isn't a crime. We're here to protect the rights of everyone in this park, and that includes Mr. Carter's right to sit here and read his book in peace." He gestured toward the growing crowd. "Unless there's an actual threat or criminal act, there's nothing more for us to do here." Catherine's face flushed a deep red, her indignation replaced by confusion and growing embarrassment. She looked at the people around her, hoping to find some validation, but instead she saw people shaking their heads, some even chuckling softly. The scene was turning against her. A few voices in the crowd were now audibly critical, questioning why she had felt the need to involve the police over something so trivial. Gabe remained seated, watching the interaction unfold with a calm that seemed almost unearthly given the circumstances. He shifted slightly on the bench, placing his book beside him and folding his hands in his lap. The tension in the air was almost palpable as the reality of the situation began to sink in for Catherine. The female officer took a step closer to Catherine, her voice softening slightly as if trying to diffuse the last remnants of tension. "Ma'am, I understand that you may not agree with Mr. Carter's choice of attire, but everyone here has the right to express themselves as long as they're not breaking the law or putting anyone in danger." She paused, glancing at the crowd, which had grown larger and more invested in the outcome. "We have a responsibility to ensure that everyone is treated fairly." Catherine's mouth opened and closed as if she were struggling to find a response, but nothing came out. She looked back at Gabe, her eyes narrowing in frustration. "So you're just going to let him sit here?" she asked, her voice lacking the previous fire it held. It was more a plea than a demand now, as if she needed someone, anyone, to understand her side and take her part. The male officer gave a curt nod. "That's correct, ma'am. There's no law being broken here." He turned to Gabe, his expression softening. "Sorry to bother you, sir. I appreciate your cooperation." Gabe nodded, his gaze flickering to Catherine, who stood there visibly deflated. There was no trace of smugness on his face, only a quiet patience. He had handled the situation with a level of composure that was beginning to make Catherine feel smaller and smaller. It was clear that she had misjudged him, and the realization of how wrong she had been slowly crept over her. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, and Catherine could hear snippets of their conversations. Some were ridiculing her, others were expressing disbelief over the entire situation. A few younger individuals, still holding their phones up, appeared to be live streaming the incident, their laughter and commentary adding another layer of humiliation to what had already become a public spectacle. The female officer turned away to speak quietly into her radio, her voice too low for Catherine to hear. Catherine watched, her heart pounding, the heat of embarrassment prickling her skin. This wasn't how she had envisioned this going. She had thought she was standing up for her community, doing the right thing, but now she was beginning to see that maybe, just maybe, she had overstepped. The officers, the crowd, and even Gabe himself had shown her nothing but calmness and patience, and that contrast against her own behavior was glaring. The male officer approached Gabe, speaking quietly, his body language respectful. Catherine strained to hear, but she could only catch snippets of the conversation. Gabe, however, simply nodded, his calm demeanor unshaken. The officer gave him a small smile before turning back towards his partner, signaling that they were about to wrap up their presence here. Then, without warning, the female officer addressed Gabe in a low, respectful tone, using a title that caught Catherine entirely off guard. "Chief Carter," she said, her words almost drowned out by the noise of the crowd, but still audible enough for those nearby. "Would you like us to handle anything further here, or would you prefer we move on?" For a moment, Catherine felt the world tilt beneath her. She blinked, her eyes widening as she processed what the officer had just said. "Chief?" Her eyes snapped back to Gabe, who was now slowly standing up, brushing off his pants as he did so. He gave the officer a small nod, his lips curving into a knowing smile. "No, thank you, officer," Gabe replied, his voice carrying easily across the now silent crowd. "I think we're all good here. I appreciate you handling this professionally." He turned his gaze to Catherine, who stood frozen in place, her mouth slightly open in shock. The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath, the realization dawning on them all at once. Gabe wasn't just any man sitting in the park wearing a Maga hat. He was Chief Gabriel Carter, the head of the local police department. The man Catherine had called the police on was, in fact, the highest authority in the very force she had summoned. Catherine's face went pale, her expression a mix of shock, disbelief, and growing horror. She had made a scene, called the police, accused this man of being a threat, only to discover that he was the police chief. The murmurs in the crowd erupted into a mix of laughter, gasps, and incredulous comments. The realization spread like wildfire, and people began whispering to each other, pointing at Catherine, their faces filled with a mixture of amusement and disdain. Gabe looked at Catherine, his expression softening slightly, though his eyes remained firm. "I hope this serves as a reminder," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made it clear he was speaking not just to Catherine, but to everyone present, that judging someone by their appearance alone isn't a good look for any of us. He paused, letting his words sink in before adding, "We all have a right to be here, to express ourselves, and to be treated with respect, even if we don't always agree." The officers nodded in agreement, their presence lending weight to Gabe's words. The crowd was silent now, the atmosphere shifting from one of spectacle to one of introspection. Catherine stood there, her face flushed, her eyes downcast as she struggled to process everything that had just happened. She wanted to disappear, to somehow erase the last hour of her life, but the reality of her actions was now starkly clear. Gabe gave the officers a nod of thanks, then picked up his book from the bench. He turned to leave, pausing for a moment as he looked at Catherine. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet disappointment. Catherine swallowed hard, her throat dry, but she found herself unable to speak. Gabe turned away, walking calmly toward the exit of the park, the crowd parting to let him pass. As Gabe walked away, the officers exchanged glances, their duty done. They had responded to a call that had turned out to be a misunderstanding, one that had revealed more about the caller than about the man she had targeted. They returned to their patrol car, the female officer giving one last look towards Catherine, her expression unreadable. Catherine remained rooted to the spot, her heart pounding in her chest, the laughter and whispers of the crowd echoing in her ears. The realization of what she had done, who she had confronted, weighed heavily on her. She had wanted to be a hero, to stand up against something she believed was wrong, but now she saw that she had made herself into a spectacle, and for all the wrong reasons. The aftermath of the confrontation in Greenfield Park rippled through the community with astonishing speed. Within hours, videos of the incident began circulating on social media, capturing the entire scene from Catherine's initial approach to the officer's reveal of Gabe's true identity. The clips, often accompanied by captions like, "Karen calls cops on the police chief," and, just as served in the most ironic way, spread like wildfire. The video showed Catherine's escalating hostility, Gabe's calm composure, and the final moment when the officers addressed him as Chief Carter. It was a scene tailor-made for viral fame, and it took off like a rocket. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Catherine, who had once believed herself to be standing up for community, now found herself at the center of a storm of ridicule and judgment. Her face, flushed with anger, then drained of color and shock, was splashed across countless screens, her actions dissected in comment threads, and her behavior mocked in memes. People who had been in the park shared their first-hand accounts, many emphasizing how respectful Gabe had been throughout the entire ordeal. The narrative was clear. Catherine had overreacted, and Gabe had handled the situation with grace. Catherine's social media accounts were flooded with comments, most of them critical. Some were harsh, calling her names, while others attempted to explain how misguided her actions had been. She read comment after comment, each one adding to the sinking feeling in her chest. Friends reached out, some offering support, but many expressing disbelief over what she had done. The story had even made the local news, the headline reading, "Local Woman Calls Police on District's Police Chief Over Maga Hat." Catherine felt like her entire world had collapsed. Her attempt to be a hero was now nothing more than a public spectacle of ignorance. In the days that followed, Catherine's sense of humiliation deepened. She couldn't leave her house without feeling the weight of people's stares, the judgment in their eyes. She was no longer just Catherine Simmons. She was the Karen from the park, the woman who had foolishly called the police on their own chief. Even her neighbors, people she had known for years, seemed to look at her differently. She avoided eye contact, kept her head down, and hurried through her errands, hoping to go unnoticed. The backlash, while overwhelming, also forced Catherine to reflect on her actions. She replayed the events of that day over and over in her mind, each time seeing more clearly how she had let her emotions dictate her behavior. She had been so caught up in her own assumptions, so convinced that she was in the right, that she hadn't even considered the possibility that she could be wrong. She had judged Gabe based solely on his hat, without taking the time to understand who he was or why he was there, and now the consequences of her actions were all too clear. After a week of hiding away, Catherine knew she couldn't ignore what had happened any longer. She needed to make things right, or at least try to. She couldn't change what she had done, but she could take responsibility for it. She could apologize. It wasn't going to be easy, and she had no idea if Gabe would even be willing to hear her out, but she knew she had to try. It was the only way she could begin to move forward. Catherine called the police station, her hands trembling as she waited on hold. When she finally spoke to someone, she asked if she could arrange a meeting with Chief Carter. The officer on the other end of the line was polite but hesitant, clearly aware of who she was and what had happened. After a long pause, the officer agreed to pass along her request. Catherine hung up, her heart pounding. She didn't know if Gabe would respond, but at least she had taken the first step. 2 days later, Catherine received a call from the station. The officer informed her that Chief Carter had agreed to meet with her. The meeting was set for the following afternoon at the police station. Catherine's stomach churned with a mix of relief and anxiety. She knew this was her chance to make things right, but the thought of facing Gabe again filled her with dread. She spent the night before the meeting rehearsing what she would say, trying to find the right words to express her regret and take responsibility for her actions. The next afternoon, Catherine walked into the police station, her heart pounding in her chest. The receptionist greeted her and directed her to a small meeting room. Catherine sat down, her hands fidgeting in her lap as she waited. She could feel the weight of her own nervousness, the uncertainty of how this meeting would go. She heard footsteps approaching, and when the door opened, Gabe Carter walked in, his expression calm and unreadable. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper as she stood up. Gabe nodded, gesturing for her to sit. He took a seat across from her, his gaze steady but not unkind. Catherine took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Gabe's. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "But I wanted to apologize, not just for what happened at the park, but for the way I judged you without knowing anything about you. I let my own biases get in the way, and I acted out of anger and ignorance. I was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry. Gabe listened quietly, his expression softening as she spoke. He could see the genuine remorse in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of her actions had finally caught up to her. When she finished, he nodded, taking a moment before responding. "We all make mistakes, Miss Simmons," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "What matters is whether we learn from them. I appreciate you coming here today. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "I hope this experience has taught you something important about assumptions, about respect, and about how we treat others." Tears welled up in Catherine's eyes and she nodded. "It has," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I know I can't change what I did, but I want to be better. I want to learn from this and make sure I never act that way again." Gabe offered her a small, understanding smile. "That's all anyone could ask for," he said. "We can't change the past, but we can choose how we move forward." Catherine wiped her eyes, a sense of relief washing over her. She had expected anger, maybe even condemnation, but instead Gabe had offered her understanding. It was more than she deserved, and she was grateful for it. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for giving me a chance to apologize." Gabe nodded, standing up and extending his hand. Catherine took it, her grip firm but trembling as they shook hands. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders. This wasn't the end of her journey. She knew she had a lot of work to do to rebuild her reputation and regain the trust of those around her. But it was a start, and for that, she was thankful. In the weeks that followed her meeting with Chief Carter, Catherine found herself reflecting on her actions more deeply than she ever had before. The embarrassment of that day in the park and the subsequent public backlash had left a lasting impression, but it was the words of the chief that stuck with her the most. His reminder about the importance of respect, about the dangers of making assumptions, resonated with her, and she knew that if she wanted to move forward, she had to take those lessons to heart. Catherine began to take small steps toward change. She volunteered at community events, working alongside people from different backgrounds and perspectives. She attended workshops on bias and empathy, hoping to educate herself and understand the root of her own prejudices. These experiences opened her eyes to the diversity of human experience, something she had previously ignored in favor of her own narrow worldview. It wasn't easy. Each day brought its own challenges, and there were moments when she wanted to retreat back into the safety of her old ways. But she was determined to be better. She also made an effort to reconnect with her neighbors. She reached out to those she had once avoided, extending apologies and trying to build bridges that had been burned by her actions. Some were receptive, others were more guarded. But Catherine knew that trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. It was a process, and she was willing to put in the time and effort. Slowly, she began to feel a sense of community again, no longer the isolated figure she had become in the wake of the park incident. Chief Gabe Carter, meanwhile, continued his work, using the incident as a teachable moment for his department and the community. He spoke at local events, emphasizing the importance of empathy and the power of understanding others. He never mentioned Catherine by name, but those who knew the story understood the significance behind his words. He wanted the community to learn from what had happened, to see it as an opportunity for growth rather than division. One day, several weeks after their meeting, Catherine found herself back at Greenfield Park. She had avoided the place since the incident, the memories of that day still fresh in her mind. But now she felt ready to face it. She walked through the park, taking in the laughter of children, the warmth of families gathered on blankets, the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was the same park, but it felt different to her now. It was a place of learning, of growth, a reminder of the person she wanted to become. As she walked past the bench where Gabe had sat that day, she noticed a few people glancing her way. Some recognized her. She was sure of it. But instead of feeling ashamed, she offered a small smile and kept walking. She wasn't the same person she had been that day. She was trying to be better, and that was what mattered. Before you go, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever found yourself making assumptions that turned out to be wrong? How did you learn from it? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story of growth and redemption, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring tales.